No one expects the truth to come from the man who made the world laugh. Not from the guy whose voice you trust instantly. Not from the face that feels safe. Not from the friend everyone assumes would protect the legacy at all costs. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. But imagine this. What if the silence finally cracked? What if the joke stopped working? What if the man who stood at the center of Hollywood's golden inner circle finally decided to speak? Not for attention, not for relevance, but because the weight had become unbearable. Billy Crystal had stayed quiet for decades. Until now. And when he spoke, it wasn't the words that stunned people first. It was the pause before them. A long pause. The kind of pause that tells you someone is deciding whether to burn down a lifetime of friendships in exchange for the truth. Because the story everyone thought they understood wasn't just incomplete. It was wrong. What really happened inside that gated estate? Why did the story shift so many times in the first 48 hours? And why did the man closest to the family wait this long before saying anything at all? Most people believe silence means innocence. Hollywood knows better. Sometimes silence is survival. Billy Crystal had been there from the beginning. Long before the headlines. Long before the tragedy. Long before the whispers turned into speculation and then hardened into something darker. He knew the family before the cracks showed. Or maybe, he just pretended not to see them. The night the story broke, phones across Los Angeles lit up at once. A legendary filmmaker. His wife. A home everyone thought was untouchable. The details were chaotic, conflicting, emotional, and immediately, the narrative locked into place. A convenient suspect. A tragic explanation. A story that allowed the industry to grieve without asking uncomfortable questions. But here's the thing no one wanted to admit. Some stories are too clean, too fast, too perfectly packaged. And when something feels that tidy, it usually means the mess is being hidden somewhere else. Billy Crystal didn't speak publicly at first. He attended no press conferences, issued no statements, avoided the cameras entirely. That alone raised eyebrows. Because this wasn't just another celebrity tragedy. This was personal. Decades of shared history. Vacations. Inside jokes. Family dinners. Moments that never made it into interviews or memoirs. Billy had watched the children grow up. He had seen the dynamics shift over time. The alliances form. The resentments harden. And if you're wondering whether he noticed something was wrong, ask yourself this. How many warning signs does it take before silence becomes complicity? People often assume Hollywood friendships are shallow, transactional, temporary. That wasn't this. This was family by proximity, by longevity, by shared secrets. And secrets have a way of fermenting when they're ignored. In the days following the tragedy, the media focused on what they could confirm. Timelines, statements, official charges. But there were gaps. Large ones. Gaps no press release could explain. Why certain phone records weren't discussed publicly. Why one family member's comments disappeared from early reports. Why insiders suddenly stopped returning calls. And most unsettling of all, why the narrative never quite aligned with the behavior of the people involved. Billy Crystal watched all of this unfold from a distance. Or at least, that's what people thought. In reality, he was being contacted constantly. Producers, old friends, lawyers who spoke in careful half-sentences. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What do you know? And Billy kept answering with the same response. Nothing. But nothing is rarely nothing. Sometimes it's a shield. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's loyalty battling with conscience in a war no one else can see. According to those close to him, Billy didn't sleep much during those weeks. He replayed conversations in his head. Moments he once laughed off as eccentric or dramatic. Comments that suddenly sounded different when viewed through a darker lens. You ever have that experience? Where a memory changes meaning years later. Where a joke becomes a warning. Where a moment you dismissed starts screaming for attention. That's where Billy found himself. Caught between the man he thought he knew and the story now being told to the world. The public wanted a villain. They always do. Someone simple. Someone explainable. Someone who allows the rest of the story to remain untouched. But Billy knew the family dynamics were anything but simple. He had witnessed power struggles disguised as affection. Competition masked as concern. A constant undercurrent of control that never quite surfaced until it did. And then there was her. The one no one wanted to talk about. The one whose name appeared briefly and then quietly faded from headlines. Why? Why did the focus shift so quickly away from her? Why were certain early statements never followed up on? Why did insiders suddenly change the subject when her name came up? Billy noticed. He always had. And that's the part people underestimate. Comedians see everything. They survive by reading rooms, by noticing tension before it explodes, by understanding what people won't say out loud. Billy had been reading this room for years. He just never thought it would end like this. The pressure mounted as time passed. Public grief turned into private suspicion. Online theories multiplied. And behind closed doors, people began asking a question no one wanted to answer. What if the truth didn't fit the story we were given? Billy resisted speaking for as long as he could, because speaking would mean consequences. For reputations, for legacies, for people who had spent decades building carefully curated images. And maybe for him too. But then something happened. Something small, but decisive. A detail surfaced. A confirmation he couldn't ignore. A moment that snapped everything into focus. And once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a manipulation. A redirection. A story designed to protect someone else. Billy Crystal had a choice. Stay silent and preserve the illusion. Or speak and shatter everything. When he finally broke that silence, it wasn't during an interview. It wasn't on a stage. It was behind closed doors, to someone he trusted, someone who would later say this. He wasn't emotional. He was resolved. Like a man who'd finally accepted that the truth was heavier than the fallout. Billy didn't claim innocence. He didn't claim certainty. What he did was far more dangerous. He pointed attention in a direction no one expected. And once that direction was revealed, the entire story began to wobble. Because if he was right, then the wrong person had been blamed. And the real mastermind had been hiding in plain sight all along. But what Billy revealed next wasn't just about motive. It was about timing, about influence, about a chain of events set in motion long before anyone noticed. And that's where this story truly begins. Because the next piece of the puzzle doesn't come from Billy. It comes from inside the family itself. And once you hear what happened behind those walls, nothing about this case will feel the same again. Everyone loved them. That was the first lie. It's an easy lie to believe, though. The kind that slides down smoothly because it comes wrapped in familiarity and decades of curated public warmth. The legendary filmmaker with the booming laugh. The wife who played the role of grounding force. The children who grew up under soft studio lights and holiday photos that looked like magazine spreads. From the outside, the family represented something rare in Hollywood, stability. But let me ask you something. How many families that look perfect from the outside are actually the most volatile on the inside? Because perfection doesn't happen naturally. It's managed, controlled, maintained through pressure, silence, and unspoken rules everyone learns not to break. Those close to the family used to joke that stepping into their home felt like stepping onto a movie set. Everything had its place. Every conversation had boundaries. Every interaction came with an invisible script. You didn't just show up and speak freely. You read the room first. Billy Crystal had read that room for decades. He noticed the pauses that lingered a little too long, the smiles that arrived half a second late, the way certain topics could clear a room faster than a fire alarm. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Every family has quirks, right? Every household has tension behind closed doors. But this wasn't tension. It was hierarchy. There was always someone steering the conversation, redirecting attention, deciding when laughter started and when it stopped. And over time, that someone became impossible to ignore. Family friends noticed it too, though most wouldn't say it out loud. When she entered a room, the energy shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. People straightened their posture. Voices softened. Jokes were recalibrated mid-sentence. Have you ever been around someone who never raises their voice, but somehow still controls the room? That was her. She didn't demand authority. She assumed it. And the family complied. At least on the surface. Behind the scenes, cracks had been forming for years. Sibling rivalries that never resolved. Old resentments buried under forced smiles. Conversations that ended abruptly when footsteps approached. One family friend later described it like this. They weren't arguing. They were circling each other. Circling implies patience, strategy, waiting. The children grew up fast in that environment. Not emotionally, but strategically. They learned what to say, when to say it, and more importantly, when to stay quiet. And silence, in that house, was currency. The patriarch ruled through presence. The matriarch ruled through perception. And somewhere between those two forces, the family learned that love came with conditions. Support came with expectations. And loyalty came at a price. Billy Crystal saw the shift happen gradually. At first, the family gatherings felt warm, loud, chaotic in the best way. But as the years passed, the laughter felt rehearsed, performative, like everyone was playing a version of themselves that no longer fit. Billy once joked privately that the house felt too quiet for people who claimed to be happy. No one laughed. That should have been a warning. The public never saw this side, of course. Why would they? The family brand depended on consistency. Appearances mattered more than honesty. Stability mattered more than truth. And anyone who disrupted that balance became a problem. That included insiders, people who asked questions, people who noticed inconsistencies, people who didn't stick to the script. They didn't get cut off dramatically. They just stopped getting invited. Calls went unanswered. Dinners stopped happening. The warmth cooled quietly. Hollywood isolation is subtle like that. And it's devastating. Billy Crystal wasn't immune to that pressure. He felt it. Everyone did. That's why so many people stayed silent when things felt off. It's easier to ignore discomfort than to risk exile. But then came the night everything shattered. The call came late. Too late. The kind of call that doesn't need explanation because your body reacts before your mind does. Shock. Disbelief. A sudden rush of memories you didn't know you were still carrying. The initial details were horrifying enough. But it was what followed that unsettled Billy the most. The speed. The narrative snapped into place almost instantly. A suspect identified. A motive implied. A story ready for consumption before the family had even processed the loss. Ask yourself this. When tragedy strikes, who benefits from clarity? Who benefits from a story that doesn't invite deeper questions? Billy noticed how quickly attention was directed away from certain dynamics. How fast the focus narrowed. How carefully the language was chosen. Words like troubled, unstable, isolated. Words that simplify complex realities. Words that protect systems. And Billy knew those words didn't tell the full story, because he'd seen the dynamics up close. He'd seen how pressure was applied subtly, relentlessly. How certain family members were elevated while others were diminished. How blame was distributed strategically long before any crime occurred. This wasn't chaos. It was conditioning. And conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. In the days following the tragedy, Billy replayed old conversations. Comments that once felt harmless now sounded like foreshadowing. Statements about control, about loyalty, about what happens when someone steps out of line. One comment in particular haunted him. A casual remark made years earlier at a dinner party. At the time, it sounded like a joke. Now it sounded like a threat. And that's the thing about jokes in powerful families. They often hide truth in plain sight. Billy began to understand something that terrified him. This wasn't just about one night. This was about years of emotional leverage. Years of manipulation disguised as concern. Years of influence exercised quietly, efficiently. And if that was true, then the story everyone was being told was dangerously incomplete. Billy wanted to speak. He really did. But speaking meant naming patterns. Naming patterns meant implicating someone who had mastered invisibility. And invisibility is power. The family closed ranks quickly. Statements were coordinated. Grief was choreographed. Any deviation from the official narrative was gently corrected, or firmly silenced. Billy noticed who was missing from the conversations, who wasn't being quoted, who seemed to vanish from the public timeline. That absence spoke volumes. Because in every family crisis, the most important clues are often found in who stops talking. As the investigation moved forward, Billy was contacted by someone he hadn't heard from in years. Someone who sounded scared. Someone who said just enough to make Billy's stomach drop. "I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending," the voice said. Pretending about what? Billy didn't ask. He didn't need to. Because deep down, he already knew. This wasn't a story of sudden violence. It was a story of slow erosion. And erosion doesn't leave obvious fingerprints. It leaves patterns. Patterns Billy had been seeing for years. Patterns that pointed towards someone everyone had overlooked, or deliberately ignored. And just when Billy thought he understood the scope of what was happening, a piece of information surfaced that reframed everything. A detail buried in early reports. One sentence that most people glossed over. But Billy didn't. Because that sentence described behavior he recognized instantly. Behavior he'd seen before. Behavior that suggested orchestration, not impulse. And once he connected that dot, he realized the tragedy wasn't just shocking. It was staged. But staged by someone who never expected the spotlight to turn their way. And the next chapter of this story doesn't start with evidence. It starts with motive. Because to understand what happened next, you have to understand what someone stood to gain. And that's where things get truly unsettling. But what came next would expose a truth no one was prepared to face. And it would point directly toward the person everyone thought was untouchable. The estate looked like paradise. A sprawling mansion tucked behind high walls and meticulously landscaped gardens. A place where Hollywood's elite could breathe, away from cameras, away from gossip columns, away from judgment. At least, that's what everyone thought. But paradise is a lie if the foundation is rotten. Inside those walls, every smile, every polite laugh, every carefully staged dinner was part of a script. And those who knew the family intimately, Billy included, knew how meticulously that script had been rehearsed over the years. Ask yourself this. How well do you really know the people closest to you? The ones you've celebrated with, laughed with, called family? Would you recognize subtle manipulation if it had been happening for decades, hidden behind charm and familiarity? Billy had. He'd seen it play out in ways the public would never notice. And he'd understood early on that appearances weren't everything. They were often the opposite of reality. The house had zones. Public zones where visitors were allowed. Areas that smelled faintly of fresh flowers and polish. Spaces designed to impress. And private zones. Darker corners. Hallways that led to rooms filled with secrets. Locked rooms. Conversations that vanished as soon as someone entered. No one in Hollywood, no matter how famous, could escape those walls unscathed. Power was exercised subtly, invisibly. A glance. A tone. A casual reminder about who deserved what. And over time, the children learned to navigate those currents with skill or with fear. Nick, the youngest, had grown up learning these lessons the hard way, observing, internalizing, strategizing, and sometimes acting. Because in families like this, observation without action can be dangerous. The tragedy didn't happen in a vacuum. It was preceded by years of tension, unspoken rules, and a hierarchy that wasn't written anywhere, but everyone followed. Billy remembered watching the dynamics over holiday dinners, over family vacations, over quiet nights when the cameras were off. He saw alliances form, loyalties shift, and subtle contests of control. The matriarch, the woman everyone underestimated, ran her influence quietly, efficiently, and with precision. It wasn't about loud commands or visible power plays. It was about shaping the narrative, directing conversations, and ensuring that certain truths remained buried. Billy knew something was off the night he noticed a small interaction between the siblings. One passing comment, almost casual, that hinted at resentment, frustration, and suppressed anger. At the time, he laughed it off, but now, in retrospect, he understood it for what it was, a clue. Because that house didn't just hold memories. It held motives, long-standing grudges, hidden rivalries, and secrets that, once uncovered, could unravel everything. Billy began piecing together patterns he'd seen over the years. Small actions, subtle manipulations, moments where someone's influence was clear even though no one else saw it. And then came the night of the tragedy. The chaos was immediate, but not random. There was a timeline, a structure, an order that suggested forethought. Billy didn't know every detail, but his instincts told him this was orchestrated. The right moments, the right people in the right place, all leading to a climax that no one outside the house would understand. As the police arrived and investigators began their work, the media narrative quickly focused on Nick. A convenient target, a young man with history enough to be suspected. But Billy knew, as did those who had lived through the family's subtle politics, that the real story ran deeper. He remembered the look in Romy's eyes when she arrived at the estate that night. Conflicted, frightened, and for someone so young, bearing witness to horror she wasn't prepared for. She reportedly spoke of a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. That statement alone suggested she'd seen things others hadn't, or that she understood dynamics most people ignored.